So, is this podcast working? How do we know?
Listen, the fact that you're asking the question tells me that if it's not working right now, it's probably going to work in the future. It's good to ask.
Welcome to another episode of Horses with Horns. My name is Indranel.
My name is Nicholas.
And today, we're going to talk about figuring out if things work. More specifically, metrics and answering the question of, is your business working out? What are metrics? What are some ways that you can measure the performance of your business? Understand if things are going in the right direction or not? Understanding the limitations of metrics and figuring out the why. Like, why am I even bothering to track things? And if something's not working, what do I do about it? So, broad topic here, but let's get into it. Let's talk about metrics. You're a data guy. What have you looked at?
Yeah, I was just going to say, having looked at analytics for a couple of years now, it's always interesting because in a small company environment, of course, metrics and analytics never loses its value, but things are so much just faster and things just need to work, and I've used this analogy in previous episodes of just trying to create that spark. You're just putting sticks together, trying to get a spark going that you just kind of feel like, okay, measuring what you're doing or tracking things, it's sort of an afterthought, right? Which in a way it is. In a way it's less important when you're just getting started. But eventually, and when I say eventually, I mean with the passage of time, not even with acquiring a particular size or expanding in a certain way. Just with the passage of time, you're going to have to create metrics for yourself to see if things are trending towards where you want them to be.
Yeah. So let's even just step back and ground in what are metrics and what is the purpose? Like, what do you actually want to get out of tracking something?
I think it's the first thing that it should answer is how's it going? Like, are we achieving what we are supposed to be achieving, right? There's that main goal that you want to know, that you want to get to. And, let's say like, hey, by end of year, I want to have 10 clients. Okay, so if you want to have 10 clients, that's the thing that you are set to achieve. In this case, this goal is very numeric, so that's easy to work with, right? But then, so broad question is, am I getting what I want to get? Or am I set to achieve the goal, right? By end of year, am I set to get this? But then, of course, you then have to peel it back and then say, okay, if I'm looking for clients, then okay, how many calls am I having? How many presentations am I having? How many outreach? And you can just go back. This is a very sales kind of example, right? And go back up the top of the funnel. So if that portion of the funnel where you want to answer is, am I doing things to get me there, right? To get me to the goal that I set. And the interesting thing of this part is, if you are, but you're not getting the goal, is then you have the other questions like, am I doing the right things to get the goal that I want?
So where's there though, right? Yeah, you can track things, but how do you know that your goal is even the right goal?
Yeah. I mean, that's super interesting. I would say that the main goal as a company, as a startup, as a small business, is to survive, right? So that's the main thing. So once you figure out how to survive, and then the next step is figure out how to do a little bit more, right? How to be more organized about your survival, and then even have days where you can kick back for a little bit, right? So in the beginning, it's going to be about, are we are we closing shop? Like, how many days away are we from closing shop? How many days away from shutting down? I think that's probably a good place to start.
So basically like avoiding that.
Yeah. So You know, are we? It's if the main. I don't want to say the main metric, but the metric is okay. How many days do I have in my bank, for instance?
Okay, so like runway, cash runway.
Yeah.
Okay.
That I think in the beginning, especially before any revenue, that's the main thing.
Sure. I mean, that's an important number forever. And coming out of our fundraising topic last week, I think that's it's definitely important. While your business will not fail solely because you ran out of money, it's definitely one of the reasons why you would. So avoiding zero cash is always a goal.
Yeah. And, you know, the other thing is that in the early moments of a business, I think what becomes very difficult is that I think two things come head to head. You know, one of them is the idea you're offering to a problem that you've identified. That's one thing. And then the second thing is your strategy to go about making that solution that you're crafting available to your future clients, right? So it's very difficult to do those two things at the same time because one is, in nature, one is a little bit more long-term and the other one is more short-term. The first one that I explained is more long-term, right? You have a vision, you have a framework for a solution, or you have the product, and that is not, or in order for you to know if that's going to work, then you need to execute all of the sales aspect of it, right? But it's very easy to get discouraged early on and then go back to saying, okay, we're not selling anything, so let me change my offering without necessarily setting a good amount of tries or good goals or good metrics for that. Okay, we're going to test out this solution. We're going to test it out for this long, and this is how we're going to know if it's even going somewhere, right? To not change things too quickly, without the evidence and just a feeling, right? Without the evidence that this isn't working.
Yep.
You know, so that I think is very important in the beginning. And one of the really good purposes of having metrics early on is that it forces you to not go back to retry or to try to fix something about what you're crafting in your head, because we tend to gravitate towards the more creative stuff. It feels more valuable, or it feels like, oh, if it's designed perfectly, then everyone's going to be coming to us instead of the other way around. But it's the metrics. I think it allows you to say, okay, slow down and focus and give it a good try.
Okay. Yeah. So I'm gonna steal this directly from work. Hopefully that's okay. How we think about things are change goals and growth goals. So I think it's getting to exactly what you're talking about, where there has to be an outcome in mind, and a meaningful one, where if you're a tiny company, you don't have customers, then yeah, you want to make sure you're not changing things for no reason.
Mm-hmm.
So when we're talking about change goals, it's here's the feedback we have, here are some metrics that are supporting this, these are product advancements we want to make. And it could even be internal. It's like these are systems and processes we need to put in place internally to handle scale. So those are like change goals. And then growth goals are exactly what it sounds like. Is revenue growing? Are we increasing our customer base? Are we retaining our customers? Efficiency metrics around that. So, kind of splitting into those two things. But I think what it really boils down to is all metrics need to have an actual purpose.
Right.
You don't track things just for the sake of tracking things.
Yeah. One of my good friends that I met at work almost 2 years ago now, shout out to Yi. He said something really cool once. He talked about what it means in a very casual conversation, right? Just one-on-one. He was saying, he was kind of asking out loud to the both of us, what does it mean to be data-driven, right?
What should my Mixpanel shirt?
Yeah.
Try to avoid wearing brands, but
Yeah. Hey, that's not bad. But yeah, what does it mean to be data driven, right? And he gave me a really good something that I hadn't considered, right? Because he said, just because you have all of your company running reports and running their own SQL queries and being able to basically interact with the data, that doesn't mean you're data driven, he said. He said, data driven is when you're able to react to what the data is telling you, you know? And I think that's a really good way to differentiate it. And I've also seen it from the consulting side, right? Being at Exodus, one of our services is data warehousing and business intelligence, and being able to provide a lens into your data or the data in a particular department of your company real time. And the main promise of that is the ability to make informed decisions, right? But that is always a difficult thing to convince someone that it's important. And it's difficult to convince yourself also that it's important, because let's say that, you know, me as Exodus try to sell an analytical platform to horses with horns. It's like, okay, I know how much followers I have here. I know how much followers I have in this other platform. And then everything is, you know, available immediately. But there's this cultural component, like company culture component, and really exercising that data drivenness of saying like, okay, you're telling me how things are going, but if I, as the company in this case, as the host and operators of Horses with Horns, if we don't have a step-by-step of what we're going to do with that data, then yeah, it doesn't add any value just to know.
yeah, totally agree. I think it's very important to remember that metrics really are like SMART goals, which I never remember the whole thing, like what the SMART acronym is. Measurable and actionable are the main parts anyway, but time bound.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, time bound.
Time bound, measurable, actionable. I don't remember the R or the S.
Yeah, I don't know. I forgot.
But in any case, I mean, that is what it kind of boils down to, is that your goals need to have a why. Your metrics need to be measurable, but I think even more importantly, it has to be actionable. It's the concept of so what? Like, okay, you tracked it. Are you going to do anything about it?
Right. Yeah, and for, I think, an early venture, right, a lot of it is going to be sales. And I think especially if your background, right, when you start a company, if you don't have that sales background, it's easier to use your time on the solution side of your business, right? There's the sales and marketing of it, and then there is the actual product, what your company is making, service or whatever, right? And if you're coming from that kind of, let's call it technical, from the factory side kind of background, right, then it's easy that you're going to default to that. You're going to default to making changes. You're going to default to building it on your own. You're going to default to, if you're in services, create a methodology for something, right? You're going to default to that. And even if you're trying to, and even if you become aware of like, okay, maybe I should do more of the outbound, maybe you'll feel comfortable saying like, oh, I'm going to write an article content about this, or I'm going to share knowledge about that and the other, right? And these metrics, I think, is a good way to say, okay, these are the things we need to do, and this is how we're going to judge our success. And if it's not happening, then of course that implies a number of solutions, right? You either decide, okay, on the very drastic side of it is, okay, this is not going to work. Let me just go get a job. Or you can say, okay, I need to stop wasting time doing these other things, and I need to look at these things that I set for myself that are more important. And then, or you can conclude, okay, I don't have that skill set, or I'm not able to get myself to do that. So I need to maybe find a co-founder or something like that, right?
Sure. So I think drilling in a little more deeply and like tangibly into just metrics themselves. So when we say about making things actionable, I think one of the first steps is just cutting down your data list. There are so many things that you could possibly track, and a lot of them are just not going to be that important, or even more importantly, are just things that you can't actually do anything about. I think some even really popular and common ones like churn rate, right? Like there is probably a point where you can no longer get it down. If your churn rate is already below 1%, I don't know how much you can do about that. So it's just something to monitor. But I think once you've narrowed your list of the most important things in the context of your goals, then you can start to do kind of what you're talking about, setting up actual action plans. Like, okay, we've tracked this metric, we have a trend. What's next? What do I actually do about it? And how do I go about measuring that what I'm doing is helping?
Yeah, for sure. I think in first episode or second episode way back is when I said, to me, the main kind of data object, to kind of go back to the analytical conversations, to me, the main data object in a company, small or huge, is strategy, tactic, project, or whatever you want to call it, right? But ultimately, a company has efforts, things that they want to do to accomplish certain things. So I think that's the main packaging of your metrics. It's like, okay, we said that we wanted to achieve this, right? So, okay, what is everything that's happening below that? What are we doing for that to achieve that? And setting goals to those metrics, and just really packaging everything under that strategy. And ultimately, the main kind of answer that you want to get to in that section is this strategy working? Should we double down on it? Should we do less of it? Should we do more of it? To me, that's like the main thing. And what the strategy is could be anything.
Yeah. So I think going into very specific examples of metrics, then I think the one thing we haven't talked about is that the size of the company and the phase that you're in also matter in what you're measuring. And I think it actually goes to what you just said. The strategy also develops, right? Like what you have to do as a tiny one-person company is probably just survive. Don't run out of money until you can get to the next step. Whereas when you are a 500-person company, it's probably more sophisticated decision-making of like, okay, how's our customer retention? Is it getting cheaper to acquire and retain our customers? Are customers in newer cohorts making more money than our first customers? And so on. But what are some of the early stage metrics that you'd look at? And then as we continue, we'll talk about how they evolve.
Yeah, well, super early on, you're going to be in some kind of MVP form of your business, right? So the main thing is feedback, I think. So if the company looks one way and the solution or the service looks one way, the design of the solution is X, then at that MVP super early stage, I think I would like to track the feedback that I'm getting, and not, of course, the feedback itself, but also just like, hey, in the next 3 months, I want to hear back from 100 people on what they think. Do they think it's good? Like, list of questions, whatever, right? But I want to get 100 people to give me feedback.
Okay, this could be a little tricky, but how do you make that measurable and actionable? Say you get feedback from 100 people. What do you do with it?
Well, once you first of all, I think it has that volume component of, so it has that pre-actionable state of, you're not going to get this feedback just by sitting down. You're going to have to go get that feedback. Right. So it has that, action that is ongoing. As days go by, you're like, oh, I'm trending behind what I wanted to be at by, July or whatever. Mm-hmm. So
true. It's already impressive if you can even find 100 people willing to talk to you.
Right. So the metric first that has that goal component, right? Like, let's get to that 100. That's what we set for ourselves, right? So that's getting there. And then when the referee blows the whistle and is done, and you can say, well, did we get there? Did we not get there? But then you have the feedback, right? And you can, of course, dive into it, start reading it, ask ChatGPT to summarize it for you or whatever. So there's some actions from the feedback that can affect the product, right? But as a metric itself, let's say, okay, did we get 100? Or no, we were set to get 100, but we only got 20. Okay, maybe the product was really bad, or maybe the people that experienced our product they're not as friendly or as close as we need them to be.
Mm-hmm.
Right? There's this famous saying, like you want to work for people that love what you're doing, not that just like it.
Yep.
And people that love what you're working on are going to be very responsive. So that could imply a change in the product and a change in how you approach the market, or that you've talked to the wrong people.
Yep.
Okay.
So I think this actually goes well into the next stage of the company life cycle. You have a product, you need to go sell it. Outreach. That's really what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
Getting in front of people and talking about like a sales funnel. What are those metrics? Think back to the IJ days of running a drip campaign.
Yeah. So depends on what you do, right? So you can email, you can call, you can do all those different things. But I think from a sales funnel, I think there's two concepts that sometimes people confuse because they mix the concepts of these two different things. And actually, when we both worked at InterviewJet, it's something that I realized. I learned it there, and I started to measure things differently once I realized. So, especially in sales efforts, sometimes people make the mistake of confusing states or like phases of your conversation with someone with your actions that you do in that conversation.
Okay.
So, there are ways that you measure your interaction with someone. Say that I want you as my client, right? So I can measure my actions. So for instance, reached out, called Indranil, email Indranil, called again, and kind of all those actions that I needed to complete that I set for myself to do. And then just, from that you get how many calls did you make, how many people did you email, and all those metrics, right? But then there's the stage of tracking. Okay, Indranil is currently someone that I'm trying to reach out to. So I'm going to call these people that I'm trying to reach out to prospects. Once they get back to me with some interest, I'm going to call them leads. Once we have a conversation and we talk on the phone about something particular or a video call or whatever, now they're going to be my contacts. Now they're going to be my friends, right? So it's also, it has a few dimensions in the way that you can track your funnel, which is your actions, right? You can have an action funnel, right? Mm-hmm. Where you say, when this happens, when someone replies, you do this, or just actions, sequence, really. But the funnel really it's more about phases. It's more about because you can email someone 100 times and they're still stuck at prospect because they never replied to you.
True. Yeah.
So there's also, it has more kind of consequential actions, where the metrics is more like, okay, you do a bunch of actions around it, but the metric is affected as consequence of your actions. It's something that happens outside of your company that has an effect inside.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And then after you've acquired a customer, if you are so fortunate, then you have your retention metrics, which is honestly also another funnel, because it is how many engagements do I have with this person? How often are they using the product? Depending on the type of business, there might be upsell opportunities where you are now guiding them to spend more on your product. Mm-hmm. And yeah, you can set up a different series of steps to try and work through that.
Yeah.
And there's a whole bunch of other metrics you can tack onto that as well.
Yeah, I mean, a funnel. Once someone makes it through, just that just means that's an invitation to start a new funnel.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like no one is ever done with you, or should be done with you.
Yeah.
So yeah, for sure. And the other thing, I think you mentioned, is the number of interactions that someone has with your product, for instance, or how many times. Let's say you have a SaaS product that, and you're tracking the number of users that log in, right?
Yeah.
So in theory, that's not something you do, right? So you can say, okay, remember how I mentioned setting up a metric, setting up a goal is also the good aspect of having those metrics, especially if they can be updated real time or whatever, right? Really good tracking is that you can work towards that, right?
Yeah.
It's something that helps you along the way. So let's say that you said for yourself that you want the average of your users to log into your product, I don't know, 50 times a month or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
To come up with a number. You don't do it, right? So you don't log in on their behalf. So it's not like you need to click log in. It's not, it's not like making 100 calls, right? But now, due to that goal, you can have the strategy of saying, okay, the way that I'm going to get my users to log in more is by reminding them, calling them, reminding them about the product, or telling them about this thing, or finding out, doing research about their industry and saying how my product can help. So the metric component could derive a strategy, and the strategy derive other metrics, right? So because eventually there's your metrics will fit in the spectrum of consequence and the action and the effect, right? The things you do to create the effect, and normally the things in the effect are your goals, because those are the things that you don't really control. And normally for a company, the success of a company, it's because of a collection of actions that you do internally, but the validation and the feedback of the success comes from outside the company, right? From clients. So that's the spectrum of action and effect. And you want to, yes, we're all looking for the effect, but we need to measure that, but we need to come up with metrics all the way to our action to be able to cause an effect.
Yeah. What are some limitations of metrics? Like what can tracking something not do for you?
Let me tell you the opposite first.
Okay.
So let's say you start tracking everything in your company unnecessarily. You just track everything. I think what that will do for you is inspire you. But that's it. Meaning, so for instance, I don't need a car. I don't need to have a car. I think I live in a very urban area. I don't need a car to live my daily life and do things for fun. But if you're going to give me a car anyway, maybe I'll think about, going to my favorite restaurant, Cracker Barrel. That is 90 minutes away or something like that.
Is that really your favorite restaurant?
All around, I think so, man. I mean, I'm not paid to say this in any way. And I should have worn the only shirt where I endorse any kind of institution of any type is my Cracker Barrel shirt.
To be clear, they don't pay us, but if they want to, they can reach out.
Yeah. All around, from quality, price, and quantity, it's very good.
I've never been to one.
Soon. Anyway, have you ever seen the, what's this? I forget. There was a PBS, maybe podcast, but they also did video. And the guy, it was political. And the guy talked to the guest, always at a restaurant, the takeout, maybe? The takeout?
I know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
I don't know the name.
And they had this kind of setup at a restaurant.
Cracker Barrel type thing?
Yeah, but with like people. And they had food, but they never ate the food. They never had coffee. They had coffee and it went cold. They're like, man, if we do this at Cracker Barrel, we're not going to do it because we're going to be eating.
Oh, yeah.
But anyway, but if you give me something that I don't need, and I'm going to have it anyway, that's going to inspire me to say, oh, maybe I can drive to the beach, or maybe I can go to Cracker Barrel. Maybe I can do all these things that without it, I wouldn't, right? So setting up a lot of metrics has the advantage of, yeah, it's going to give you a bunch of unnecessary things. You're going to have to, find parking for it and just park it and just look at it being parked and not use it. But at moments, it's going to inspire things that otherwise you wouldn't have considered, So, so that's what metrics can do for you. And in that way, I'm hoping that I'm also answering the question of like, what's the limitation? Which is, it's just that. Metrics can inspire you. They can inspire action, strategy, thoughts, different ideas, changes to what's happening and being done in the company. And those changes could be drastic, right? Because they're data-driven decisions. But they're not going to make the changes for you, of course. And then they're going to... I think they're also not going to interpret themselves. Just because something doesn't work or is failing or and you have all the numbers to that, it doesn't mean that you have the answer of what to try or what's broken.
So I think I'm actually going with a similar thing here, where one of the limitations of a metric is not actually the metric itself, but your understanding of the metric.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes data can be scary. It can suggest that something is deeply wrong and you might want to completely change your business, or you like freak out and spend 3 weeks trying to get to the bottom of whatever happened.
Mm-hmm.
But if you misinterpret it and you make one of those changes, it can actually be terrible. Whereas sometimes random things happen.
Yeah.
Again, I'll use a work example. Last year we saw a dip. I don't even remember what month it was. But we saw like a pretty big dip in the data. Didn't necessarily make sense. It was a hurricane.
Mm-hmm.
Once we dug into the data a little bit more, it wasn't like our business model fell apart or something was drastically wrong with the product. And, thankfully we didn't make changes because there was not actually anything to change. It was that there was a hurricane, and which means that, Florida tends to be a pretty big state for us. People just weren't doing things for a few days because they had a hurricane.
Yeah.
So if you don't have that context, and if you don't know how to interpret your data properly, you can end up making bad decisions.
I think to support and at the same time kind of give a different picture to that is that one of the benefits of having good metrics, and when I say good metrics, it's also basically very updated metrics, right? That you don't have to work to do tracking. So one of the benefits of having that is that it gives you speed to react. And in this case, right, if you just react to the dip without finding out that it was weather related and it had nothing to do with your service, or you could say, well, everything's connected, there's something we can do about it, but sure.
Sure, if you can stop a hurricane, great.
Yeah, or if you can say like, hey, whatever, right? But you can always react to something in one way. But where I think metrics make a difference is in speed to make changes. Whenever I've spoken with executives, especially at bigger companies, it's always surprising when I hear this from executives in technology, not just the company, but their role is in technology. And they talk about metrics and measuring things. And a lot of times, one way or another, I've heard, the way that we know something is working is by trying it out. And these people really have the thought of like, no one knows. And there's nothing you can do to know, right? Besides trying.
Yeah.
So I guess the opposite of predictability, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think they're under the assumption that everything is unpredictable. So the only way to know is by trying. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. But I also think if you try, then it would be... So if trying is your source of knowledge, then it would also be really convenient to know when something's not working very soon.
Yeah. So I think you have to do things to even create a scenario where you can have metrics. If you don't do anything, you don't have any metrics. But also, as soon as you start doing things, it should be on your list to track success in an actionable way of like, okay, I'm collecting this data because there are potential things that I can do because I have the data.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think so. To really just sum things up, it's you should track things fairly quickly. You should make sure that whatever you're tracking is time-bound, measurable, and actionable. That you're not just tracking every single thing that's totally possible. It's just that you're always asking, why am I tracking this? And also that you shouldn't necessarily panic. Like, there are limitations to data where just because you see something might be off or something looks a little different in your data than you'd expect, don't panic. Just understand that there isn't always something wrong. Like, you can either fix it if there is, or hey, maybe nothing's actually wrong.
Yeah, and especially I think at an early stage of a company, in my own experience, I think it's important to set up metrics for the things you don't want to do.
Yeah.
And also setting up metrics for very long-term, very abstract things. I think it's also valuable. So, for instance, how many people did you network that you told them about your company? Or how many events did you attend? Or, how many courses on entrepreneurship did you take? Like, things that don't seemingly have a direct effect. It's also good to track those abstract long-term things, because at least you're working on things that could surprise you.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Because you don't need to track clients and if you're selling, because in the beginning, them memorized. Like, if you have a client, you don't know if you have a client. That just doesn't go by you.
You don't remember your number one client.
Yeah, no. That's not a problem. So tracking all of that is not a problem. But you should track those things that you think are not too important that might be, and the things you don't want to do is also important to track. A lot of calling, a lot of selling activities, all of that is important to keep track of.
Cool. Well, speaking of tracking, that brings us to the end of this week's episode. We will see you next time for the last episode of the first season.
Last episode. See you next week.